So welcome everyone to this meetup and hosted by the Brochure Foundation. And my name is Sally Davies and I'm editor at Eon magazine. It's my absolute pleasure to host this conversation about the past, present and future of human experimentation. Now, as many of you are aware, the rapid development of COVID-19 vaccines over the past couple of years has brought the ethics of human pharmaceutical trials to the forefront of the public and political conversation. It therefore seems like a timely moment to take stock of the often neglected, troubling and tumultuous history of using humans as test subjects, and to consider how this history is likely to affect the dynamics of biomedical research in the future. So we're going to speak for a total of about 45 minutes. To start with, we're going to hear from our esteemed panelists for the first 20 minutes to provide an overview of the subject, and then the last 25 minutes will be devoted to Q&A. So for those viewing, please do feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and I will select as many of them as I can for consideration in the second half of this conversation. So first thing to do is just to ask each of the panelists if they'd be so kind to introduce themselves. So I'll start with you, Dominic, since you're first on my screen.
Well, my name is Dominic Cremo. I'm a professor of health law at the University of Neuchâtel, where I founded an institute 30 years ago, Institute of Health Law, and I'm currently the chair of the Research Ethics Committee in Lausanne, which is one of the largest university hospitals in Switzerland.
Thank you so much, Dominic. Ulf, I'll move on to you.
Well, thank you, Sally. My name is Professor Ulf Schmidt here at the University of Hamburg. I'm currently running a large ERC grant on post-war medicine and public health, and I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Health, Ethics and Society.
Thank you. OTMAR?
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is OTMAR KLOIBER. I'm a physician by education, have been working in research, but then in organized medicine, first with the German Medical Association, and now for about 16 years with the World Medical Association, and I'm the Secretary General of the organization now.
Thank you very much. And finally, Andreas.
Thank you, Sally. Welcome, everybody. My name is ANDREAS FREWER. I'm a professor for medical ethics at the University of Erlangen-Nuremberg. I'm a member of institutional review boards, research ethics committees, and other bodies to organize research. And we had a lot of debates and a big project with the Brochure Foundation in the last years. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We've got a fascinating spread of expertise here. So to start with, we're going to hear from Dominic, Ulf and Andreas to provide some ethical and historical background, and then we'll move on to OTMAR to situate that within the historical context. So Dominic, Ulf and Andreas, do you have a preference as to who would like to speak first?
Yes, that would be me. I think we're starting with a bit of history, and I think that might, just to put things a little bit into context for the audience here today, and just to sort of, obviously for us, it's a great honor to be speaking here today, and also in a sense present some of our findings, which we published recently in a multi-authored volume on ethical research with OUP. So this is my pitch, and now I can move on. Obviously, this is an important topic, as you already highlighted. The topic of human experimentation within the context of the pandemic is something which is of great relevance and will surely be of further discussion. So let me just place some of these issues a little bit into historical context. A number of critical events in the 20th and 21st centuries have led to a reconsideration of basic principles of medical ethics. And I think it is fair to say that one of these events was the prosecution of German scientists involved in Nazi medical atrocities after the Second World War. It resulted in intensified emphasis on the requirement of informed consent, something again which is very relevant today, and also the moral accountability of scientists, funding organizations, and other associations. In a sense, the Nuremberg Code, which flowed and resulted from that first trial after the war, it tried to balance medical progress on the one hand, on the need for medical progress, with the protection of individual participants and patients. It focused on individual human rights, and it also paid great emphasis on patient-subject autonomy. Now, in the decade after that, the World Medical Association, which itself was founded after the war, reaffirmed its broad support for Hippocratic medical ethics and ideals and values, and it formulated that in the so-called Declaration of Geneva, 1948, and also in the International Code of Medical Ethics in 1949. But it was initially, the organization was initially reluctant to extend that discussion into the field of human experiment and develop a new code of ethics. So it took about a decade and a little bit more of further discussions until 1964, when the Declaration of Helsinki was finally formulated and promulgated in Helsinki. It's incredibly important document to this very day. It's a living document. It's been revised many times, and we are very grateful and honored here today to have Dr. KLOIBER, who really, I guess, is one of the leading experts on the development of this document in our panel today. So I think he will certainly put things further into context. Now, let me just, before I conclude, address one second critical event, which invites a reassessment of basic principles of medical ethics which is the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, however, this time, the matter seems to be pulling in a different direction, from individual human rights and personal autonomy in medicine and medical science to what one could call to greater degrees of social responsibility towards the common good, reflected in problems as disparate as the wearing of masks, vaccination requirements, and equity in vaccine access, research and distribution. So one of the issues which might be of relevance for our debate today, how do we get the balance right between respect for autonomy and social responsibility in medicine and research without going back to a time where medicine was largely a paternalistic field and in which state intervention was high on the agenda. So that's where I leave it for some introductory remarks and hand over to Dominique.
Thank you, Ulf. Well, as the lawyer in the room, I have been puzzled by the importance of the Nuremberg Code during the past year, in the sense that at the middle of the first wave, my research ethics committee, but many others, we share exactly the same experience. We're confronted to requests from large research institutions, from academic institutions, university hospitals, requesting to do research without consent. And one would not have imagined in 2020 to have such requests. It was so puzzling that the European Association of Research Ethics Committee had to publish a position statement reminding that in the middle of a pandemic, one should not lower the standard, but in the contrary, one should higher the standard in terms of quality of research. And we will hopefully speak about this and the need for science to be enforced, the security of the participants, of course, but also the respect of their fundamental rights and their dignity. And I think this is important also to put in the balance this pressure that has been developed by well-intentioned researcher to accelerate the research process at the expense of human rights. And I'm very thankful to the Association of the Research Ethics Committee, to the Swiss Association of Research Ethics Committee, to have made such a statement to remind the researcher about the need of respecting the will of the participants. This is something that make it even more important to keep in mind the history of the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki. And I think I look forward to discussion today and having a chance to chat with my colleagues and the people who are looking at us right now. This is very important. And I give the floor to Andreas.
Thank you very much, Dominique, Ulf, Sally, and Ottmar. It's really a pleasure to see you. It would be better to be in Geneva at the beautiful Brochet Foundation, but the pandemic doesn't allow that. So it's good to have participants even from Africa here in this roundtable. Great, and welcome to all of you. And we have guests and high-ranked experts from the WHO as well. From the project, together with Ulf and Dominic, I want to quote just one short part of a famous philosopher of the 20th century. It was Hans Jonas, who half a century ago formulated a very interesting statement. I quote, "Let us not forget that progress is an optional goal, not an unconditional commitment, and that its tempo in particular, compulsive as it may become, has nothing sacred about it." This is a quote from his philosophical reflection on experimenting with human subjects from the year 1969. And I think it touches all those sensitive points. We don't have time in a pandemic, but we do need good research standards. And as a member of a research ethics committee, I experienced that hastening projects and doing more trials and lowering the standards is a really critical ethical questions for our time. Maybe just this very short reflection on the beginning. I'm looking forward to a critical debate of this very important topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a fascinating scene-setting exercise, and I was frantically taking notes for the purposes of our later discussion. So thank you. At this stage, I'll hand over to OTMAR, who will be able to discuss the contemporary landscape.
Thank you very much, Sally, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very eminent panel here. Indeed, the COVID-19 pandemic has raised a number of questions in connection with the Declaration of Helsinki and the ethical conduct in doing research or not doing research where research would be necessary, which is also an aspect of what we have seen during the pandemic. But let me start, as my previous speakers did, with the beginning of it, the time after World War II. And not all of you will know that the World Medical Association was founded in September of 1947, just 1 month after the verdicts and in the so-called doctors' trial in Nuremberg were handed down. And one of the very important ideas that since then has penetrated all our work and thinking is that not everything that is allowed can be done or must be done, that not everything that is allowed by law is ethically correct and should be done by physicians. And that is something that also flow into the then Declaration of Geneva a year later, into the International Code of Medicine. And since then has been certainly a part of our relations to the practice of physicians, whether it is in research or outside research. To me, it is indeed also quite puzzling that it took then another 17 years until the Declaration of Helsinki came out as a first international document on research ethics. Let's remember the Nuremberg Code was in an American trial in Nuremberg, a military trial, and actually it has never been adopted by anybody. That is quite interesting. Actually, I would say to a large extent it was forgotten. And in the work then for the Declaration of Helsinki, there were also other things from the time being that influenced the creation of the Declaration of Helsinki. Those I had a chance to speak to, of participants who were members of the WMA at that time, of the delegations. They said, well, it was very much also under the impression of the thalidomide crisis in the beginning of the 60s, which quite obviously showed that there was something awfully wrong with research in health and in producing medicines at that time. So the Declaration of Helsinki became, in the first place at that time, I would say an enabler for research by giving it an ethical foundation there. It has over time certainly shifted very much to the aspect of subject protection. which does not mean that it has lost this double function, also to be an enabler. And I think it is a very strong enabler of research. I would even say without such a framework of ethics research, human research probably would not be acceptable for most people. And in the time then, over the years, the declaration has certainly crafted a number of cornerstones for regulation in the research field, which I think have been some of the most important cornerstones of development in medicine in the past century, especially the informed consent. That was not an invention by the World Medical Association, no way. There were already other institutions which applied that. There was already legislation, even in Germany, since the beginning of the 19th century, of the 20th century, I'm sorry, which required something like that. And even in the shortly before the Nazi Reich, this was reaffirmed. Nevertheless, obviously it was not applied. And quite obviously, it didn't have a place in the ethical thinking on the international scene. And to me, the informed consent is certainly the biggest step forward in medical ethics at that time, and still is of crucial importance, as Dominic has pointed out before. The second big step, which we have seen in '75, was then certainly the involvement of ethics committees or internal review boards. Which, by the way, don't only have a function to protect the subject of research, but also the researchers themselves. Because it's an extremely strong protection for you doing experimentation to have a recommendation by an ethics committee or an approval by an ethics committee in your bag. I think that is something that we should not underestimate, and which, in my understanding, also makes it necessary that there is a connect between an ethics committee and the researcher and the participants or the subjects of the research. So an ethics committee cannot be somewhere in the world. It has to have a context with what is going on in order to fulfill these protective elements. And third, among many other steps which have been taken and regulations which have been taken by the Declaration of Helsinki, finally, the commitment to share data is of crucial importance, because what we have been seeing in research is too often too much secrecy. And that is something that the Declaration of Helsinki wishes to avoid, or actually commands to avoid. Now, during the COVID crisis, we have seen a number of challenges to the declaration, or in the ethical
landscape
behavior, I would say, of physicians which have been doing research or have not been doing research. Certainly, the question is, one of the questions is, how could trials being structured in a way that is ethical in the situation of a high emergency? The question, for instance, of control groups is one that is still active when you are testing new vaccines. Certainly something that is still under debate, and I'm not quite sure that we have a final answer to those questions. The compassionate use of drugs is something that has been brought in connection with the Declaration of Helsinki. You know, there is a last clause in 37 of the Declaration of Helsinki which allows the compassionate use of drugs to be then applied when anything else has not worked. But it does not replace the need for doing proper research. And that means it is not allowed to do something that has no scientific basis, and then to repeat it over and over again without putting it into a proper research protocol and examine it correctly. So that is something that has been done, unfortunately, has been done quite often during the pandemic, and it has been accompanied by then also a number of studies which in their quality have not been sufficient. And again, the Declaration of Helsinki demands a certain quality of research to be done, because otherwise the requirements for safety and also for reliability are not given, if that is not the case. And finally, we come to the question of common good that has been already raised. We have heard very often that with the clinical trials for new vaccines, knowledge has been used that has been to a large extent created in universities, in public laboratories with a lot of public money, which absolutely is true. That is, on the other hand, probably true for all research that is being done. And at this point, the question of the use of research becomes an ethical issue, as people believe that the contribution of public funds, of public money, then also means that there is a public ownership to something. To some extent, this is already addressed by our patent system that we have. For instance, in most countries, you cannot patent something that has been already published. On the other hand, the patent system nowadays leaves ample leeway to get patents for things which are to some extent new. All too often also to things which are very difficult to really be described as real inventions. Nevertheless, the question has been raised whether there is also an ethical problem attached to the use of public knowledge in research, and then to exploit this knowledge on a private basis for profit in an industry that is living from profit. At that point, I must say this is an interesting discussion, which also the World Medical Association certainly has to lead and has to be involved in. I'm not quite sure whether it is a discussion that we can solve with the Declaration of Helsinki. To me, that is probably a little bit a separate issue that we have to discuss. Nevertheless, there are, and I may take this moment to speak about some other contemporary issues that are in the discussion now for the Declaration of Helsinki, and which are certainly have catched our attention over the past years. One of the things that we are seeing is that there is a much stronger involvement of patient and patient groups or patient initiatives in research, to an extent that sometimes is to be seen critical, because protocols may get distorted by demands from patient groups and by influence from patient groups in a way that is not scientifically justified, which may serve the interest of the patients, but not necessarily the interest of the scientific correctness. We have questions of inclusiveness of research. Who has been included in research processes? Is it forever only the rich world that is included? Is it forever that only young men are included in research? Do we have to have a stronger focus on the diversity that we have to reflect in the research as well? Certainly something that is under discussion, and I'm not quite sure whether the Declaration of Helsinki stresses this enough as it is right now. Thanks to WHO and UNAIDS, we had a discussion on prevention research and the question of vulnerable groups. When it comes to prevention, the vulnerable groups very suddenly get to be the groups which are concerned. And at that point, the Declaration of Helsinki currently may be a little bit too defensive in order really to address to vulnerable groups or to concerned groups for which protection is needed and prevention should be designed. We have over the past years the questions of real-world data use in research, be it for comparators, be it for structuring whole experiments. which we haven't had before because simply the means of collecting and processing data have not been there. But certainly we have to look into that. We have more and more diverse forms of trial designs, adaptive trial designs, more branched trial designs that we have seen in the past, to which the classical distinction that is still in the Declaration of Helsinki may not be enough, may have to be developed, or at least has to be interpreted. So there is a number of trials which I think we will have to discuss, including also challenge trials, which came up now with the COVID-19 pandemic, especially, where I believe that there are a number of ethical questions that we have not raised properly. And finally, and I will close with this, a lot of experimentation is now being moved into the virtual world. I mentioned already the question of real world data. So not to do an experiment really in a group, but to use the expertise or the information that comes from big masses of data in order to structure experiments, which then can be performed virtually. Now, to that, the question is, how do we extend the protections that have been given by the Declaration of Helsinki? For instance, the informed consent or the approval by ethics committees into this virtual world. On one hand, to give a similar level of protection. On the other hand, also to allow the use of these new tools, which open, I think, avenues to many more research methods, questions, and answers than what we have seen so far. So this is something where the connect between the Declaration of Helsinki and the Declaration of Taipei is probably not perfect, what we have right now. And I think this is something where we have to improve the Declaration of Helsinki in order to lead over to this new tool, the Declaration of Taipei, in order to think about research ethics in virtual worlds, in virtual environment, without having real persons, but with the possibility of harming real persons. That is very important. So this is about the field which we are in the current time in which we are discussing. And you know that the Declaration of Helsinki has been last revised in 2013. I expect that very soon the Council of the World Medical Association will commission a new work group into look into a revision of the Declaration of Helsinki. Again, not with the mandate to change it, but certainly into the mandate to revise it and to see whether changes are necessary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, OTMAR. That's absolutely fascinating. We only have about 15 minutes left and many different strands to touch on. I think the first thing that would potentially be useful for our audience is to just concretize this discussion somewhat. Ulf, you mentioned this notion of critical events and the way certain events in history have trickled through to produce ethical and regulatory change. Now, obviously the landscape of medical ethics that exists today is in some ways a legacy of the Second World War and the Holocaust, the horrors of which some of our audience will be familiar with. I'm just wondering if there are other events that are perhaps less well known that have affected the contemporary landscape of medical ethics and regulation that you might like to touch on. I know, for example, you've written about the nerve gas experiments at Portendown. So I just wondered if I could perhaps open the floor to the panelists to discuss some of these examples from history that have produced regulatory change in the landscape of medical ethics.
Thank you, Sally. I will keep it brief because the examples of ethical violations is so long, I'm afraid, that we would probably be here for another hour. But I think you're absolutely right. There are many examples, unfortunately, which have certainly led to scientists and experts to pause and really think, what is going on here within science as it was developing in the 20th century. Let me just highlight a couple of them. I think for the United States in particular, I think the Tuskegee Experiments, which began in the 1930s, on uninformed, unconsenting African Americans. They were organized by members of the Public Health Service, and you can imagine already now that really is deeply ingrained within an American culture, that actually members who were financed through state authorities were involved in those types of research. And there is a certain skepticism as a result of any types of experiments, even state-led experiments, till to this day, which some have described as a program of controlled genocide. Just as an example, these tests ran from the 1930s into the 1970s, and then they came to the fore in the early 1970s, and obviously led to regulatory changes in the United States. As you mentioned, for the United Kingdom and other places, we have experiments within the military, whether it's throughout the Cold War, whether these are research on soldiers, again without their consent, often in all sorts of areas, whether it's non-conventional weapons in terms of biological and chemical warfare research, or indeed within the context of nuclear warfare. So in that context, a lot of research was done, which, at least from our perspective today, would not have complied with what we would see as ethical research. And I think Dr. KLOIBER raised an important point. Why did it take so long after the Second World War, 17 years? I think the answer is complex, but one issue certainly was this was a decade when researchers they didn't really see the need, at least certainly not in the West. They did not see the need for any type of code or ethical regulations. It was seen, as J. Katz once formulated, as a good code for German barbarians, so to speak. It was formulated in Nuremberg, and an unnecessary code for so-called Western scientists. They did not see that this was something which was applicable to them. It was part of a German a response to German war crimes, and they felt that Western science in particular was ethical, which, as we now know, it wasn't. But Dr. KLOIBER also mentioned the Thalidomide experiments, very important, and that these kind of events, they really led researchers and scientists to reconsider. So what we are seeing when we're looking at across the century, we often see a response mode, i.e. something is happening which doesn't work well, and then the international community, ethicists and organizations come together and try to reassess and reform these principles. It's very rarely that we are looking forward into the future and trying to improve the principles before something is happening, I'm afraid.
Thank you, Andreas. I think you wanted to
just make some additional remarks. Thank you very much, Dr. KLOIBER and Professor Schmidt, for your basic background, and that's very important things. But just maybe I agree to 95% of your talk, Dr. KLOIBER. Was really excellent. But just to mention one point, tomorrow is the day of the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg trial, and the day after tomorrow, the 10th of December, you know, it's the International Day of Human Rights, and we should focus also the human rights tradition, because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was another instrument to ban those crimes against humanity, and to have a new tradition to base on human dignity of every person and every person participating in human experimentation in particular. So, Dominic, I hand over to legal positions.
You're still on mute, Dominic.
This is a key element in the history of research ethics. Thalidomide was mentioned. In the 60s, the regulation of drug trials was put into laws. And today, in most countries, research ethics is not only based on the Declaration of Helsinki or on self-regulation of the medical profession and the researcher, but it is based on statutory law adopted by the legislator in through a democratic and hopefully respectful to human rights process. And for that, I think we should also be aware that there has been a big change. Until the middle, I would say until mid the 80s or so, you still had a lot of self-regulation. At least in Europe, there has been a huge change in the sense that research involving human participants now is regulated under the law with a human right approach. And this is important to mention. And the human right dimension and the fact that the participants themselves empowered themselves in the sense to make sure that their dignity and rights were protected when participating makes a huge change. There has been a switch in the nature of the regulation that took place in, I would say, in the 80s, very forcefully. Before that, there was examples, there was, various cases, but it became really more general in the 80s. And we are still building on this. And this is very important, that the medical profession does not bear by itself all the responsibility of coping with the ethical issue related to research. And this is very important because I don't think the physicians themselves want to take that responsibility, are willing to take that responsibility. And this is important to have a democratic and public debate about it. And this is where I think the law has an importance. The situation right now shows the importance of trusting the government in the pandemic, and you can see some countries are doing better than others in the trust we have in our government. Some governments are doing better than others in being trustworthy, in fact, and this is also important to stress.
Something I'd like to pick up on here is this question around rights. And Ulf, in your introductory remarks, you commented that the COVID pandemic as a critical event has entailed a reassessment of the balance, ethically speaking, between questions of autonomy and rights on the one hand, and questions of collective responsibility and social responsibility on the other. Now, I'm struck by the fact that human rights discourse, of course, is in some respects a byproduct of the same historical moment as the medical ethics regulations. And but lately, rights discourse is not without its critics. That is to say that there are intellectual historians and others who say that the advent of rights discourse coincides with unprecedented levels of inequality and has, in some sense, distracted from substantive questions of justice. Now, this leads me to ask, in the context of medical ethics, does the pandemic put pressure on the utility of rights in the sense of, do we need to discard them, or do we need to change them to focus on something else, or does it rather reaffirm the need for them to be respected? Or do we to double down on rights discourse? I'm not sure who'd like to jump in there.
Well, I mean, if I may, I mean, you have a very obvious discussion about this when it comes to mandatory vaccination. I mean, this is the point right now where it culminates in the question of what does it mean to have your rights and have your autonomy? Where does it start and where does it end? And quite obviously, the pandemic has brought a very strong focus on these questions, which we unfortunately have not answered in the years before. We should have done so before. We have not. And it now culminates and leads to a lot of tension within society. Unfortunately, it has not been prepared, even under the pandemic, it has not been prepared and not been approached by politicians in a proper manner. They just have changed their mind from one day to another, instead of really having a proper discourse from the beginning about that, which they try to avoid for other reasons, like, for instance, upcoming elections or just not to be popular. Yes, it is indeed a very difficult question that comes up. I would a little bit, well, not disagree with Professor FREWER. The human rights are an important instrument in our background, but let's not forget in the beginning, in the 40s, in the late 40s, when it comes to health, the human rights were still very cloudy, to put it friendly. It took really another half century because we now have a very precise understanding of what it means have health as a human right, and also to transform this into the research environment. So at the beginning, that probably was a little bit remote from the question of doing experiments and maybe even of providing healthcare, because let's face it, at that time, 90% of the world didn't get healthcare. They haven't even seen a physician. So.
Would anyone else like to comment here on this question of whether we need to reassess rights discourse or double down on it in light of the pandemic?
Maybe I will have a different discourse about it, in the sense that actually looking at the international health regulation, that is the founding document of WHO to cope with the pandemic. It includes elements that provide guidance on how to deal with the situation today. But what we have noticed is that a lot of the elements that the government are using right now go beyond what it is in the international health regulation. And for that, I think the government, and here, obviously, we are not very diverse group today, and I apologize for that. But from a European point of view, we have laws that are protecting human rights, which are also allowing for limitation of the human rights under specific conditions. And this balancing is something that is intrinsic to the law and the legal process and the judicial process. And thanks to countries where you have the rule that are run by the rule of law, where you have access to a fair access to a judge and to protect your rights, then you can have a balancing on the individual situation versus the public situation. The rights are extremely important in the current process. And you can see that in some countries, like in China, where human rights are certainly not as important as it will be in other region of the world, they dealt with the pandemic in a very brutal way, which luckily did not happen here, in spite of the fact that some people are complaining about the limitation of freedom. So we have to be conscious that at least in the current situation, the rights have proven to be very protective and useful.
May I there come back once more? Actually, my answer was a little bit driven by the luxury situation in which we are here in the rich countries of this world. And Dominic, you pointed this correctly to the international horizon. The big elephant in the room when it comes to rights is, of course, the equity question. You know, that is the by far biggest question in here. It is also by far the biggest failure which we have, why we are not really making progress with this pandemic, because we are not sharing enough, and we are not honoring the rights of other peoples, of other nations, in order to get protection and help with that. That is absolutely correct. Yes.
Thanks so much for this generative aspect of the discussion. I'm going to turn to a couple of the questions that have come up in the chat. We have a very interesting question here from Simon Lewin, asking the panel to comment on the issue of informed consent in cluster randomized trials of policy interventions. For example, trial interventions that might be implemented by a government agency anyway, but which are rolled out across geographic areas in a randomized way. Countries appear to differ in their regulations as to whether individual consent is needed, although that's often not practicable. So I'm just curious if the panel has any comments on that.
Yeah, well, I wish I had a chance to consent when something like this is rolled out over me as a citizen in a country, and to many of those experiments which are being done there with living creatures, I would not consent to. That is certainly very clear. I think what we have not done in the past is we have not done really to find the right instruments for substituting something like a consent or an informed consent for these trials, or for these changes, or for these political experiments, what has been done. We have so far trusted that the democratic structures, that parliaments, that governments themselves have enough clout in order to do the things in an ethical way. But just having this hope is obviously not enough. And that is what we see quite often, because we see changes which disadvantage certain people, which have not been asked. We see changes which have detrimental effects to health of certain groups that are being rolled out. And yes, they have never been really tested. They have never been tested for their whether they're ethical. They have never been tested whether people are really willing to participate in those. And I think we need new instruments in order to test those.
Oh, if you want to jump in there.
Yes, I think that just as a historical comment, I think Dr. KLOIBER raised really it's a very good question, and it's what Dr. KLOIBER said is also very important. Just historically, any of these kind of trials, which I think one of the questions referred to, with large populations where consent is impractical, just from a historical perspective. In the United Kingdom government performed large-scale aerosols and airborne biological weapons trials in the 1960s and 70s, where they would be spraying certain types of substances across areas in southeast England. Some of these, which we now know, are actually to some degree even harmful. So if you were walking your dog outside at night, you might have been receiving a substance where you certainly would not have given consent. The issue with these types of trials is exactly that. What instrument is actually there to protect you as a citizen in those kind of contexts? Because the Declaration of Helsinki, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Dr. KLOIBER, I do not think the declaration is really applicable for these types of trials. At least I could not see it for covering those kinds of large-scale trials where consent is inapplicable. Now, I looked into this to some extent, and I came down to national law and the role of government, which is ultimately there to protect its citizens. And I think that's something which you addressed. The first role of governments is to protect the health and welfare of its citizens. So in a sense, that's where we are back to democratic and obviously the integrity of nation states, which in a sense is quite an anachronistic instrument, if I may say so, in the 21st century. But please, anybody, please correct me if I'm wrong. If you have any better ideas, what is there to protect patients and not patients, but people in those kind of circumstances? Dominic.
I don't think that informed consent could not apply in such situation. There is a good example. WHO launched the malaria vaccine implementation program in 2019 and 2020. And I am part of a group of scientists and researchers who were worried about the fact that consent was not offered to the parents of the children being vaccinated through those implementation program. I believe that this is a matter of designing your action, your intervention. In public health, this is the same. And this is very important for the public to understand. When we are speaking about mandatory vaccine, for instance, we're not talking about forced vaccine. Even in a country where you have mandatory vaccine, nobody will be forced to be vaccinated. And when you are implementing cluster randomized trials of policy intervention, you may also have opt-out issues, and you need to have a public debate about it and public information. The danger is that when actually the scientists and the public health authority by themselves take the responsibility to impose their choice. And this is not something we want to see happening. And I believe that the increase of citizen science and the increase of public participation in research is a very positive step that we are observing, because actually, contrary to what some researchers believe, the patients can understand even complicated issues. The public is not stupid. I really want to insist on that. You have to confront it. You have to deal with it. And I believe, to the contrary, that instead of stating from the beginning, oh, informed consent does not apply, say, how can we actually apply informed consent without the individual process that we usually expect? And I want to stress that in the Declaration of Taipei, which is the complement of the Declaration of Helsinki concerning research with data, patient data, and with biosamples, there is Article 6, paragraph 2, that explicitly recognize the fact that when they are authorized by national law that has been adopted through a democratic process in respect of human rights, they can be arrangement with the process of informed consent, not the principle, but the process. And this is where I think it's important to be really prudent in not lowering the principles, but in contrary, to think how can I implement them in complicated situations.
Okay, I totally agree with you, Dominique, but let me just ask you a little bit of a poignant question. What would you say if these trials, which were in the 1960s and 70s, these were secret? How would you obtain consent?
Well, the trial you are referring to that were from the past, I don't believe that today they could have taken place and they could be taking place in a secret way. And this is the whole point. Science is about transparency, is about sharing information, is about sharing data. And today there is a central element about benefit sharing and open data that are a combined process. And I think this is important to have in mind that Africa as a continent has been very much used for genomic research. And now you have several countries such as Nigeria that are reacting to that, saying, well, the sample should stay within our country. The analysis of the data should be done within the country. We have to do that also for respect of our population and involving the patients. And I know patient groups in Nigeria which are very active in promoting research with the participation of the population. So science is bad science. I don't believe today that a scientist by himself or a group of scientists by themselves, even somewhere, can do good research. And bad science is bad ethics.
Thank you very much for this. I'm just conscious that we're getting to the end of the discussion. I've extended it by 10 minutes, as I mentioned in the chat, because there are so many angles to cover off. I apologise in advance that I can't get to all the questions that have been raised in the chat, but one that I think is particularly important. A commenter has remarked on the necessity to disentangle global bioethics from being tied to large donor bodies, philanthropic financial bodies, and industry interests. Now, I think this is particularly interesting in the context of the question of what ethics in an emergency looks like, which OTMAR raised, and which, of course, in some sense, we've all just lived through in the pandemic. So I wonder if, as a parting thread of the discussion, we could talk about the history and future of the role of corporate interests, how they have affected medical ethics, and ways in which they ought to be curtailed or controlled in the future.
May I answer to that?
By all means.
First, I must say that we have seen in this pandemic an excellent and outstanding performance of health personnel, of nurses, of doctors in clinics who have worked extremely good. But we have also seen a very responsive, fast, immediately acting industry. So there has been a lot of companies, and we are always talking about the three which have now been the winner of this race in Western Europe and the United States. But there have been many companies which have put in a lot of efforts in order to produce vaccines, in order to produce medicines. To me, the market at this point, and I don't want to be uncritical to the market, but the market at this point has performed actually quite well. And we have a lot of things which have not worked. I don't want to talk about politics. That makes me depressive in this circumstance. But there are a lot of things which have not worked. And why are we not looking to those things which have to be fixed? Why are we all yelling now at the industry which has performed and which has delivered the drugs which we need? I was very, very surprised that in such a short time they were able to come up with vaccines. I would not have bet on that we would have in 2021 already a working vaccine, or actually several working vaccines for that. So I'm a little bit puzzled by everybody is jumping on the industry, while at the same time there are so many things which don't work. And let's face it, the problem of equity in this world is not a problem that we solve with the industry. That is a problem that our politicians have to solve. And so far, I have not seen any creative idea from them.
Andreas, would you like to jump in here to make a contribution?
Yes, thank you very much. I think OTMAR KLOIBER touched a very important point. You're totally right, and we need the industry, but we need transparent research. And just to comment on other questions in the chat, like Anne raised an important question about data protection and data use in the world. You see the case of safari research, that industrial companies are going to several countries in the African states, for example, and then they take their results with them and leave the country, and there's no capacity building, there's no long-term impact on the country. So I think there are several things that we need to have a closer look. And just to point out the question of conflict of interest, I think we can share our experience within the book Ethical Research, and I have to give a compliment to the WMA that they allowed our historical research with Ulf and Dominic that we made, and to make some conflicts of interest in the history of the WMA transparent. And that is a question of culture and ethical reflection, and we need that for human experimentation. It's very sensitive.
Thank you. Dominic, I think you wanted to jump in there on this question of the role of the market and corporate interests.
This is clear that historically in the 60s, there has been an industrialization of research, especially drug research. And it has had a lot of importance in also the development of the regulation, for instance, with the ICH-GCP. Nevertheless, the issue is not only about, as OTMAR mentioned, about industry or certain group. It is about all the conflict of interest. And in my work as a lawyer, the worst scandals that I have observed during the last 20 years didn't come from the industry, but came from academic research within large university hospitals, where you have a lot of conflict due to the pressure of the career of the scientists. And today there is a movement in ethics that is dealing with conflict of interest, and that is improving. Behind all that is a matter of governance. And I think governance of data, governance of research institutions, governance of research ethics committee is extremely important, and it's taking a growing importance today, because governance is not only about management at the operational level. It's really about the inclusiveness and the participation of all the stakeholders in the discussion. And we are experiencing right now, I think, a change of paradigm in this domain, in the sense that the Declaration of Helsinki was complemented by the Declaration of Taipei in 2016. At the same date, at the same period, the CIOMS adopted new recommendation on biomedical research, which included a principle 11 and 12 that also spoke about governance. And then you also have the Council of Europe and the OECD that adopted documents about research with health data and biobanks that referred to governance. When these elements of governance will be better understood and better implemented, in the sense that it is not the responsibility of the single researcher very often to cope with the complexity of the ethical issue. This is the responsibility of their institution where they are doing the work, and their funding agencies, and the authority, and the public, the social insurance, and so on. When this will be better introduced, I believe that within the 10 coming years, we will see a change in the way we are coping with all those issues. That will be much more inclusive, that will allow more democratic discussion and more inclusion of patients and the public. And this is extremely important.
Thank you so much for those uplifting remarks. Ulf, I was going to invite you to have the final word, whether about this specific point or whether you'd like to make a more generalized statement about the discussion as a whole.
Yeah, sorry, my point might not be as uplifting as Dominic's, but that's the nature of the beast in this group. I would just to add to this, I think we should not be naive about the industry. I think we're dealing with unbelievable amounts of money here. And just to give you some ballpark figures, which we published in our volume, in 2016, the industry made $1.1 trillion in that year alone. That is about the GDP of Russia alone as a country. And just to put that into perspective, and we looked into obviously some of the trials which were less ethical and where there were ethical violations in place. All these companies, when approached, said that they were certainly following the Declaration of Helsinki. Now that raises an important issue. To what extent, what is the role of these ethical guidelines? How really is this more than a rubber stamp exercise, what we're going through here? And I think we need to constantly reflect how accepted are these principles, because that has something to do with accountability of these industries. And I think we have to continue to work and make it clear that there are people who are looking at these experiments and assess them when they're being done. The problem with some of these trials, as Dominique and Andreas mentioned, often the actual companies, they farm them out to other companies who would then perform them, and there's no real direct line of accountability. And I think that's something we need to also bear in mind. For the people involved, when they are being experimented on, the recourse to the law, often the actual companies sit completely elsewhere, not in their country, is very difficult. I think we should not forget the participants who are actually undergoing those trials. And if these trials are not going according to plan, the recourse to the law, or at least to justice, is not an easy one. At least from the historical examples we've been seeing over the last 20, 30 years, I think there's still a lot of work to do to convince also industries to make sure that they are actually following the rules and take part in these conversations we're having here today. So I don't want to end on a sort of downward note, but I think we should also be realistic.
Thank you. Well, look, this was an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I just apologise that we weren't able to open up all the many other avenues that presented themselves. But thank you all for sharing your perspective. And yes, I'm very grateful for your expertise. And I can see Dominique is recommending that for further reading, turn to their book. Which has certainly been an excellent primer for me for this discussion. So thank you all very much, and hope you can join us for the next meetup. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.